My name is Benjamin Paloff. I'm the acting director of the Copernicus Center for Polish Studies here at the University of Michigan. And thank you very much for joining us for this roundtable, which is formally titled Assessing the State of Play in Polish Politics, but which several of us have been referring to informally as the post-mortem of the Polish presidential elections. And before we begin, I want to alert our audience to some of our other upcoming events and also to say a quick word about how we're going to proceed. On Wednesday, October 28th, please join us from 12 to 1:30 p.m. for a lecture, Music and Resilience in Early Post-War Poland, by U of M Assistant Professor of Musicology Mackenzie Pierce. This is an event co-sponsored by the Center for Russian and East European Studies. And then from November 6th to the 8th, we welcome the 27th Annual Ann Arbor Polish Film Festival, which will likewise be held online. And in collaboration with the film festival and under the auspices of the Copernicus Lecture in Polish Studies at the University of Michigan, we are pleased to be able to share with you an interview with acclaimed filmmaker Agnieszka Holland. For more information about these and all of our other upcoming events, how to register for these events, as well as for some online-only bonus content that we are going to be offering during this pandemic semester, and all of other information, you can always turn to our website. That's ii.umich.edu/Polish. That's also where you can learn how to support the Copernicus Center for Polish Studies. So the way we will proceed is we will have a sequence of brief remarks by our guests on the Polish presidential elections, followed by an open conversation. Those of you who may have questions are welcome to submit those questions using the tab at the bottom of your Zoom menu. And I will be reading those questions and feeding them to Professors Grzymala-Bus and Porter-Szucs. So this roundtable comes almost a full year since our November 20th roundtable on Poland's parliamentary elections. And the world has changed more in the last 11 months than I think any of us could have predicted, and indeed these 11 months feel in some ways more like years. This only underscores the importance of taking the temperature, so to speak, of the moment as it unfolds, and to help us do that, it is my pleasure to welcome our two contributors to today's roundtable discussion. Anna Grzymala-Bus is the Michelle and Kevin Douglas Professor of International Studies at Stanford University. She is also has been a longtime faculty member of the University of Michigan, where we all miss her terribly and are very happy to have her join us for conversation once again. Our second speaker is Brian Porter-Szucs, the Arthur F. Thurnau Professor of History here at the University of Michigan. And without further ado, I'm going to step back and give the virtual microphone to Professor Grzymala-Bus.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It's lovely to be back, even if virtually. I have a bit of a presentation, so I'm going to share my screen. Great. Fantastic. Okay. So as I mentioned, I'll talk about what the Polish presidential elections of 2020 show us about Polish politics more broadly. And what I'll do is just make 3 points about the party and the president, the overall party weakness and ineptitude, and how the presidential elections really exemplify both of these trends. So first, of course, PiS, Prawo i Sprawiedliwość in Poland, the crown on Kaczynski's head is entirely coincidental, has been governing Poland since 2015. And it's really set out as a goal for itself to consolidate power and ensure its long-term incumbency by going after the courts, the educational system, the media, and in some cases standing accused of fomenting societal division, all in an effort to remake the country into what it considers the true Fourth Polish Republic. It's a bit stymied in this effort because it doesn't have a constitutional supermajority, and because the Senate is now, since last year's elections, held in opposition hands. The president that PiS has put forward is, of course, Andrzej Duda. He was elected first in 2015 and then again this year. He's handpicked by Jarosław Kaczyński, and he's generally a very compliant, servant is too strong of a word, but a very compliant official, with occasional flashes of autonomy, as in 2017, when he vetoed one of the 3 proposed laws on the judiciary. But for the most part, he's a faithful servant of the party and the party's leader. The party itself isn't going anywhere. The blue line that you see up top, the one that hovers between 40 and 50%, is the electoral support for PiS. And as you can see, it's simply the unparalleled party in Poland. It garners the plurality of support day in and day out, no matter who its various opponents might be. And of course, the question is why that might be the case. On the one hand, I would argue there's the popularity of some of its policies, such as Rodzina 500+, the sort of subsidy per child that each Poland family gets. But on the other hand, there's also the very real weakness of political parties that PiS sort of takes advantage of, and the presidential election really exemplified. So when it comes to political parties in Poland, we have the familiar story of over 100 competitors in the first fully free elections in 1991, consolidating over time to only 5 parties in 2020. But that belies an image of, that image belies basically a constant turnover and a fairly radical fragmentation of the political parties. There's that old joke that, with 3 poles, you'll have at least 5 political parties. And it certainly seems that that's an underlying tendency. The main sort of core, the core of the left-wing opposition, SLD, is basically gone. It's largely sort of, imploded as of 2003, 2004. Meanwhile, on the center right, Platforma Obywatelska, now known as Koalicja Obywatelska, was in power from 2007 to 2015, where it rapidly sort of stood accused of a kind of complacency, of a lack of accountability. Above all, it was a center-right party, but it did very little to differentiate itself from PiS, which is also a center-right party. Instead, what Platforma offered were basically the politics of warm water from the tap, a continuation of a satisfactory status quo with no real innovation or change. And however complacent its leader, Donald Tusk, may look in this photo, the subsequent electoral sort of fate would make him far less happy, despite the ice cream cone that he's holding. In the 2020 presidential elections, Platforma, now Koalicja, ran first as its candidate, Małgorzata Kidawa-Błońska, who is serving a longtime party official, clearly pretty capable and all that, but not very popular at all. And so she gets replaced midway through the election by Rafał Trzaskowski, the popular, if controversial, mayor of Warsaw. And so you, on the one hand, have this image of a powerful PiS, and on the other hand, sort of, a set of opposition parties that are fragmenting and that are unable to project a cohesive or differentiated image. But lest we think that PiS is all powerful, there are also strong indications that it's weakening. First, there are the internal divisions. People like Gowin and Ziobro have basically formed their own factions and occasionally threatened to withhold support. Kaczyński himself has been forced to go from being an eminence grise to actually entering the government. He preferred to rule from afar, but he was forced to enter the government last week, basically, to support the prime minister, to assuage conflicts, and to basically hold in check Ziobro himself. Above all, what I would argue is that PiS has authoritarian commitments, but not much competence. And so, for example, when it comes to its abortion restrictions, which it announced in 2016, these were met with massive protests and withdrawn in a sort of state of confusion. With its much criticized judicial reform, the overhaul of the judiciary, if you actually take a look at it, is piecemeal and incoherent. The Chief Justice, Małgorzata Gersov, pictured here, simply ignored the order to retire and went back to work. And there was precious little the government could do to stop her. Above all else, the election, the presidential election during the pandemic, really showed the extent to which PiS can be stymied by its own incompetence. So during this election, it became very clear that about a third of the voters would refuse to participate, no matter what, in in-person elections. PiS refused to delay the elections, and what followed was the farce that was known as the May 10th postal ballot. So PiS announces the postal ballot. The post office is supposed to be in charge, not the Electoral Commission. And what follows is a series of steps that's something out of Keystone Cops. First, the post office basically emails local officials to get the rolls of electors, which is totally not allowed by law. The company that's in charge of printing the ballots is printed by a company affiliated with PiS that's best known for advertising flyers and novelty napkins. The ballots quickly become leaked. Basically, everybody can see what they look like, and that means that there are sort of extra ballots floating around ready for electoral fraud. And it also becomes clear that there's simply no way to count the ballots before the second round of elections. And the result is best described as Schrodinger's election. The Senate vetoes the postal elections. Remember, the Senate is now in opposition hands, and it kicks the decision down to the lower house. And there, a totally extra legal agreement between Jarosław Gowin on the one hand and Jarosław Kaczynski on the other takes place. And they basically announced that the election would take place, but the courts will declare it invalid. Confident, apparently, that if they say that the courts will declare it invalid, the courts will do that. The Electoral Commission basically enters the fray and announces that free and fair elections are impossible on the 7th of May. And so the elections are held at the 10th of May. They are invalid. Finally, we have delayed elections at the end of June, June 28th, the first round, July 10th is the second round. And the entire sort of procedure basically reeked of both incompetence and lack of preparation. It was basically a political party that didn't know what it was doing, even though it had been the incumbent for now 5 years. The broader implications of, I think, this presidential election, and so then the things that we repeatedly see, is basically, on the one hand, the opposition remains weak. And so PiS governs by default. It is where it is, not because it has such a spectacular offer, but because the opposition has been unable to credibly claim that it is responsive, that it is different from PiS, and thus something to offer the voters. The presidential elections are also an exemplar of PiS incompetence. If the opposition is weak, PiS is inept. The good news, however, out of all of this, lest this become a little bit too depressing, is that this basically means that a kind of Hungarian path of full authoritarianism, the kind of sort of basically reconstruction of the constitution and the government that we see in Hungary to the end of keeping the governing party in power indefinitely, isn't very likely. And that's because PiS doesn't have the parliamentary supermajority. The Senate is held in opposition hands. And above all, PiS is stymied by its own incompetence and its own inability to sort of project a cohesive reform program. Thank you very much. I'll stop sharing my screen now. Okay.
Thank you very much, Anna, I just want to say very quickly, for anyone in the audience who's having any difficulty hearing the speakers, they're coming through quite loudly, actually, on my end. So if you could adjust the volume on your own computers, your own screens, or if that doesn't work, then there is a live transcript at the bottom of my screen that most of you should also be able to access through the live transcript button. And it does offer some very creative transcriptions of Polish names, which adds additional entertainment. And with that, I cast the speaker to or cast the microphone to Professor Porter-Szucs.
All right. I also have some slides to share. Let's see if I can do it. Is this working? Are you seeing my slides?
Yep. Yep.
Okay, excellent. Great. So I put this this title for my section of the talk today up, and my first thought was, oh my God, I really wish we were in the aftermath of the 2020 elections. That would be a wonderful place to be. Of course, we're not talking today about those elections, but rather about the series of elections that happened in Poland over the past year. So I think that these elections have reinforced something that I've actually been arguing for quite some time. And that is that Poland is an incredibly diverse country. Okay, looking at these stats, at these charts, you don't see a lot of diversity, right? And this is, in fact, the conventional impression that one gets of Poland. It's what you'll hear from most Poles. That is a country that has had relatively little immigration. It is a country that is overwhelmingly Roman Catholic. It is a homogeneous country, and many will say uniquely so. That's true, but only up to a point. And actually, it's that we get to that point rather quickly. In fact, Poland is a very diverse country. It is divided, though, on ways along axes that we aren't going to immediately see, right? Because the measures of diversity that we are accustomed to here in the United States are not marked in Poland. However, other lines are. And if you're Polish, you will know very, very quickly which tribe, which community you belong to inside Poland. If you're talking to a person, you can tell from the way they speak, the cultural references they make, to some extent, sometimes how they dress, what cultural references, what they read, what they watch, their forms of entertainment, who their heroes are, on and on and on. It doesn't take more than a few minutes of conversation before you can know, am I talking to one of us or one of them? I'm not sure this would have been the case 20 years ago, but it certainly is the case now. There are two Polands, not one. And this divide is right down the middle of the country, and it is deep indeed. So if we go back to the parliamentary elections, the 2015 and 2019 elections, we can see that PiS has never had a majority. Yes, they've had a consistent strength. They are a large party. They are an important party. But they are not a majority party. Even if we add in the other votes of other right-wing parties, we don't get much of a majority, if a majority at all. In fact, in the 2019 elections, if you add up the main parties of the center and the right, we end up with about 9 million votes. And if you PiS, meanwhile, got 8 million votes. So in that election, at least, they were somewhat behind. Now, because of the complexities of Polish electoral law, they end up with a majority of the seats. But nonetheless, things are very, very close. And this was evident, I think, really evident in the presidential elections. Those elections could have gone either way. They were really, really close, with 10 million votes for Duda and 10 million votes for Trzaskowski. The difference was quite marginal. And so it wouldn't have taken that much, it doesn't take that much imagination to spin out an alternative history in which Duda loses this election, because the country is so evenly divided down the middle. And in fact, this election had very, very high turnout, so that further bolsters the case that we are looking at some pretty deep and pretty pervasive divisions in Polish society. And moreover, there's very little movement from one camp to the other. And what this means is that Polish politics today is not really about different policy proposals, arguments about different ideas about fiscal policy or social policy or this or that. It's really an appeal towards cultural values. Who is on our team, who is on their team, and what goes with that. Well, what does go with that? What are these two cultures? Well, geography is a factor. When I say that Poland is split down the middle, that's almost literally true. You can draw a line going from the northeast to the southwest, and on one side of that line you will find the bulk of the PiS supporters, and on the other side the supporters for one or another of the opposition parties. It's quite stark. Now, a lot of people have made a big deal about this little juxtaposition here. You can take the old map, and by old I mean before World War I, when there was no Poland on the map and the partitioning powers of Russia, Germany, and Austria-Hungary still controlled this region. You can take that map, you can overlay it on an electoral map, and it is quite striking how it lines up. People have been noticing this since the early 1990s. These voting trends have been there for quite some time. I don't want to make too much of this, though. I don't want to make too much of this because it overlooks something very important. And that is that in the Russian partition, you have Warsaw and Łódź, and also to some extent Białystok and Przemyśl, Przemyśl in Galicia, in the Habsburg partition, which vote very strongly for the opposition, right? And because these are urban centers, that's where a lot of the people are. So if you actually are looking at electoral percentages, it doesn't quite line up as neatly as these maps might have us believe. Still, for a historian, it's quite interesting and quite neat to see this overlay. Mapping this onto economic divisions also shows a certain pattern, but it doesn't get us all the way to an explanation. It is definitely true that the southeastern region of the country, which is the real center of support for law and justice, is quite poor. These are among the poorest voivodstva, provinces in Poland. But also, areas, you can see areas in the west and the north also are economically struggling. In fact, the poorest region in the whole country, it depends on which year you survey, but Mazuria in the far northeast is often there, and that area does not vote heavily for peace. So, the economics on a geographical level don't help us all that much in predicting how the elections will go. Although economics will come back into the picture, I'll return to this in a moment. So rather than geography or economics on a macro level, I think the main divide, as I suggested earlier, is in fact cultural. Deeply rooted cultural differences that have actually been around for a very long time, but have come to the fore and consolidated in a way that maps them clearly onto two political factions. Much like in the United States, the cultural divisions were always there, but in the past they didn't always line up with partisan divisions. Now they do. And that's very much the case of what we know here in the United States as well. One way of measuring this, again, very familiar to Americans, is by looking at urban versus rural. I alluded to this earlier. This is actually a much stronger predictor than which zone of the country you live in, is whether you live in a town or in a city. And so you can see it's quite the mirror image of each other there. Contrary to a common perception, Poland is not overwhelmingly rural. It is more rural than Western Europe, but it is about 50-50 urban and rural, much like the division in the vote. You can see this category of small towns. That category in Poland, in Polish law, is not divided by the size of the town, or rather, it is on the upper limit, 20,000. But on the lower limit, there is no lower limit. You become a town for demographic purposes in the statistical office if you have at least 60% of your population working outside of agriculture. Then even if you're a small agglomeration, you can call yourself a town, right? So a lot of those towns are quite rural. But on the other end, we're talking about towns of 20,000 people that are definitely towns, right? So it really is more or less about half and half, rural, urban. We see a similar contrast when it comes to occupation or status. Now, here's where we get back into the wealth issue, but again, only indirectly and imperfectly, actually very imperfectly. So on the one hand, you have farmers. I think rolnik is the category used by the survey, and you have workers, working class people, blue collar workers. So you would be inclined to think, okay, so people lower on the economic ladder are more inclined to vote for law and justice. People with more wealth are more inclined to vote for the opposition. And to a certain extent, that is true. But look a little closer here. First of all, among that category of farmer, you have both poor peasants, quite a lot of them, and they would dominate that category, but you also have people engaged in quite prosperous farms, because there are those in Poland. So you have a mixture there. And then on the other end, and this is actually much more important, on the other end, you have service and administration. Now, on one level, that's going to include people who have rather high up positions in some administrative apparatus of either a private or public office. But it's also going to include low-level clerks. It's going to include school teachers. It's going to include a lot of people whose incomes are quite low. So this is not just about money or wealth or access to it. It's about certain professions, and I think the cultural patterns that accrue to those professions. Education. Again, this is another thing that will be recognizable to an American. Education is also a really strong predictor. In fact, it is the strongest of the predictors that I've shown so far. The more education you get, the less likely you are to vote for law and justice. The terms that I've been using recently in some things I've written about these two camps, and these are just shorthand words, don't take them too literally, but I've been calling them meritocrats and communitarians. I think this is a way that sort of helps us understand the nature of the division we're talking about here. On the one side, we have those who have fully embraced the modern, quote-unquote, subjectivity, modern self. The idea that we are autonomous individuals with free will, and most importantly, that we are self-created. That we create our own success through our hard work, our diligence, our natural talents, somewhat, but also our choices. That when we face problems, we look for ways to solve them individually by taking a training course, right, or buying a self-help book or whatever. So such people strongly believe that their position in life is credited to what they have achieved. For people in this camp, corruption is very disturbing, but when they talk about corruption, what they really are bothered by is nepotism. Anyone who would rise up to a position of power and authority without going through any of the hoops of the meritocracy. So there's particular outrage when it is noticed in this camp that law and justice promotes someone because of party loyalty to a position of power, even though that person might not have the qualifications. In many of the discussions of the judicial reforms, people who have been promoted to the position of judge without having the expertise or experience that would typically qualify someone for that job, this is considered a true outrage. But getting away from politics, for this segment of the population, we see an appreciation of family, appreciation of tradition, of course, and I don't want to overstate this, but it's conditional, and that's very important to note. So, for example, if a woman is in a marriage with an abusive husband, well, the right path is to leave that abusive husband. That one's personal safety is, it would seem as obvious, to place above the idea of family itself, that abstraction couldn't be placed above the safety and well-being of anyone threatened by an abusive husband. Okay, now switch this over to the other side, the communitarians, I'm calling them. Here, as the label would suggest, we're talking about people who prioritize the good of the community. Now, in this particular case, we're talking about the national community, Poland. I don't want to use the word nationalist, though, because this cultural bloc can actually coalesce among other vectors as well. It's not just about nation. It just happens to be in the case of Poland. Anyway, for here, that which is good is that which advances the interests of the community. That which is bad is that which hinders the community. So in economic matters, dealing with policy, this implies a sort of rough egalitarianism, very rough, not as a universalistic principle, as you might hear advocated on the left, but rather as the necessary social glue that can hold the community together. So, on the one hand, this is a group where we wouldn't be surprised to see if someone has trouble, if their house burns down, that their neighbors will rally to help them out. That's part of the community. That's what you do. If someone is in destitution, you find a way to help that person out, assuming they are members of your community. But conversely, from the other side, there's a lot of skepticism towards people who rise above their station, right? Who get too big for their britches. So there is this sort of rough egalitarianism. In this cultural model, there is perfect understanding if someone has to maybe go to Western Europe to work in migrant farm labor, or to go to London to be in the construction industry for a year or two as a way of sustaining the family. That's perfectly understandable. What is not understandable, what is not approved of, is if a young person from the community goes away, gets an education, gets a job in a firm, gets promoted to the London corporate headquarters, and pursues a career there abroad, abandoning the community for selfish personal interests. So within this framework, getting to the cultural, more intimate cultural sphere, let's go back to this example of an abusive marriage. A woman caught in an abusive marriage is going to, hopefully in the best of cases, receive emotional support from other women in the community, but the woman who responds to the abuse by divorcing her husband is going to be subject to a lot of unkind gossip, and that will not be looked upon favorably as a rule. The son who goes on vacation with his friends and his nuclear family instead of returning for the holidays to the broad extended family, again, that won't be understood, that won't be appreciated. Now, I've emphasized these issues about personal life, family, personality, because I think it helps us understand that we're not just talking about policy here, although there are policy ramifications for all of these things. We're talking about a cultural divide that is embedded in the intimate sphere and embodied in the personal interactions that people have on a day-to-day basis. And that means it's a divide that's very hard to overcome. Not likely to be overcome by, for example, persuasion or arguments about which is the best option for Poland's future. It's not that kind of dispute. Now, close with this last chart. Some have suggested that even if what I've just said is true, it will still change because we see an age difference. That the higher age brackets vote disproportionately for law and justice. So as the demographic realities move forward, we're going to see more and more of today's young people becoming older, and therefore you might see this divide change, not through persuasion and not through any change in the cultural divide, but through the withering away of one side of this cultural divide. That might be true, maybe. I'll believe it when I see it. It is equally possible that the one way in which we do see change between these groups is as an individual grows older. That's equally possible. So I guess time will tell. And on that, I look forward to hearing your questions.
thank you, Brian and Anna, both of you for your wonderful remarks. And with that, I will begin feeding you questions. I'm just going to throw these out as I receive them. The first question that has arisen is from a second-year law student, in fact, at the University of Michigan, who has asked, how can Kaczynski and Govin agree on a judicial outcome? And does that difficulty itself speak to the extent to which the judiciary is not independent?
Yep. Next question. There is no independent judiciary in Poland.
I don't think it's gone quite that far. I think this is simply exigency, right? And this is sort of the expedience, rather, where basically what happened was that Govin threatened to withdraw his support from the governing party, which would have meant a minority government for peace. And so, because of that, Kaczynski was willing to basically concede the point and not hold the elections. It was too late to cancel them, and so that's the deal they came up with, knowing full well that even an independent judiciary would have found these elections to be invalid. The most fundamental thing here is that they were held by the post office, not by the electoral commission, and the post office has no constitutional right to hold the election.
To elaborate from my smart aleck remark, there are still independent judges in Poland. Absolutely. The judiciary has not been purged nearly to the degree that you see in, for example, Hungary. But we do have a situation now where any case that that Law and Justice really cares about can be channeled to judges that they can count on to rule in the way that they want. So that there are still independent courts on an individual level. Lower level cases can well go in any direction, but on the big matters, I think that this is a battle that peace has, for now, won.
That actually, I'm wondering if I could just throw in a follow-up question to that question. We do have other questions in the queue, but given that we are currently going through a debate about the role of the judiciary in the United States right now, I'm wondering whether the situation in Poland would seem to forecast the shape of the debate that might occur in other regimes where an authoritarian or soft authoritarian regime wants to try to basically do an end run around democratic institutions simply by turning to the least democratic branch of government.
Yeah, so I think the pattern that we observe is wherever you have authoritarian populists or authoritarians take over power, the first institution they go after are the courts. And the reason for that is very simple. It's not because the courts aren't democratic. It's because the courts are the one institution of oversight and control that exists over the executive and the legislative, especially in a parliamentary system that's there in Poland and throughout Europe. So in those systems, basically the executive and the legislative are fused, and the only check on power is the judiciary, it becomes the number one target for these would-be authoritarians. And it's always justified in the name of making making justice closer to the people and to better represent popular interests, which of course are entirely concordant with the governing parties.
The one area where it could diverge, that's a really interesting question. I hadn't really thought about it in this way, and maybe this won't happen. But there is a difference in the rhetoric that peace used to justify its moves against the courts, and the rhetoric that the right in the United States uses to justify its new attention to judicial, it's been quite right, its new achievement of domination in the judiciary, and that is that it's a majoritarian versus a minoritarian defense. So what Law and Justice was saying as they were taking over the courts is that the courts are unelected, and therefore they should not be able to overturn the decisions of the people, which are represented in Parliament, which is an elected body. This unelected elite, that was a line that you heard a lot. What I'm hearing more and more here in the United States is, such as the tweet that Mike Lee from Utah sent out during the vice presidential debate last week, when Kamala Harris made some reference to democracy, and Lee's tweet was, "We are not a democracy. We are a republic." And the constant reference to a strict constitutionalism, quote unquote, is also a way of affirming that that it's not, we want the courts to be a check on the possibility of democracy. And so now this could be a rhetorical difference without meaning in practice, maybe, but it does, I think, point to what could potentially be an interesting divergence in the strategies of authoritarianism in both sides of the Atlantic.
That's a useful and frightening answer. There's a question from Jeff Tomaszewski, a U of M staff member, about the voting trends for expats. Very interesting, since both of your presentations really focused on what was going on from the electorate as we see it demographically breaking down within Poland itself, but an enormous portion of the Polish electorate actually lives abroad.
I haven't seen the number. Anna, have you?
Yeah, so it's a very variegated or very differentiated electorate. The older wave, people who emigrated after World War II and through the 1980s, tend to be much more conservative than the post-EU accession wave, people who emigrated in the 2000s. And the quickest comparison is just look at Chicago versus London. Chicago overwhelmingly votes for peace. London overwhelmingly voted for Trzaskowski and Platforma. So it really has to do with the cohort effect, basically, and when the waves of immigrants left Poland. But there are very clear distinctions between the two.
Which loops together very well with the next question, because Elizabeth Marshall, who's an undergraduate student at the university, is asking how much foreign countries are influencing, or maybe foreign cultures perhaps, are influencing the changes that we observe in Polish youth culture, and how much of that change is otherwise endogenous, and how much of it is a kind of international youth culture.
I would lean towards the international, but again, that sort of two Poland's vision that I was suggesting would also apply here as well. But I don't want to draw that too tightly. That's there's a great cartoon that shows some members of the radical right nationalist youth organization complaining about all of these immigrants coming in and then saying, "Yeah, let's go get some kebab now." So the influence, international circulation of cultural patterns is present on the in both zones. Agnieszka Paszeka is an anthropologist who we've seen here at U of M several times. Has done some excellent research recently, ethnographic research on the radical right in several countries in Europe, and what she's found is that their transnational networks are very deep, and that for example, events in Hungary have provided inspiration for young youth groups, radical right youth groups in Italy and in Poland. And so, there are these transnational networks that function really on both sides of this cultural divide. So while it might be more evident on the surface that you're seeing a more cosmopolitan, urban hipster youth, I think the transnational influences they exist all over the place.
The only thing I would add is that, and this is with the caveat that the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. What we don't see, what is prevalent across other authoritarian populist countries, is the influence of Russia. So you just don't see this. You don't see the kind of agreements between political parties of the kind that you saw in Italy, Austria, or Hungary. You don't see the invitations for intervention. You don't see the kind of internet, malign actions of the kind that you see in the United States. For whatever reason, there doesn't seem to be much evidence of that kind of foreign interference in Polish politics.
So there's a lot of interest among the among our audience, which I'm pleased to say is quite substantial. I'm very happy that we do have close to 50 participants in this webinar. So thank you all for joining us. But there's a lot of interest in this, in trying to understand the other demographic vectors among these camps, so how we're kind of breaking down the Polish population. And Irina Vlasova, who's a first-year grad student in Crete at U of M, is interested in one dimension that neither of you really mentioned, is gender, or for that matter, I mean, sexual orientation or might come into this as well, but just in terms of, you know, basic gender demographic breakdown, which we can track quite easily in a place like the United States, and we're constantly being told about college-educated women versus men without a college degree, etc. There hasn't been quite as much conversation about this, at least that I've heard from Poland.
You know, I don't know of that much difference in gender patterns. The bigger difference is age and occupation, as Brian stated. There isn't much difference if you just look at men versus women. That cut doesn't much make sense. Of course, you know, here Duda didn't do himself any favors with his references to LGBTQ ideology and to gender ideology, which is something of the classic trope of a conservative religious language in Poland. And that definitely sort of hurt him with what would have been some of the sort of younger voters that he was trying to get.
The only thing I actually haven't in the exit polls that I looked at, I didn't see a breakdown in gender. Maybe so I'm not sure on that. I do have maybe one data point that is anecdotal and indirect, but interesting, and that is that a big report, and I wish I could remember the author, it's escaping me right now, but a big report that came out last year looking at transnational marriage patterns in Poland. And what they found was that in transnational marriages, Polish women were overwhelmingly marrying West European men, and Polish men were overwhelmingly marrying Ukrainian or Belarusian or Eastern women in transnational in those who did choose transnational relations. And then in focus groups that accompanied this study, one line that they heard did refer to from many of the Polish men in this particular study, saying, well, the Polish women don't want to be traditional women as we want anymore. And then Polish women saying exactly the same thing, and thus both looking for what they would like to see in a partner, but going out of the country in different directions to do so. So, I mean, there probably is, I think if we dug down into the numbers, there probably is a slight gender, meaningful gender difference, but it is nowhere near as stark as it is here in the United States. But I think it exists.
Well, there's a really interesting. Jessica Robbins has raised an interesting kind of dimension of that in the Q&A. Jessica Robbins, who, by the way, is an anthropology professor at Wayne State University, who gave a wonderful presentation on aging in Poland just yesterday. And I think several of the participants were able to tune in for that as well. And she points out that this example that Brian had given in his remarks about domestic violence is a way into the discussion of gender expectations. That it would seem that, at least for those who align more with what Brian was calling the communitarian kind of identification, that the strong role of traditional Polish Catholicism. I don't want to say Catholicism generally, because Polish Catholicism is very much its own interpretation, I would say, it would seem to also require or demand certain gendered hierarchies within and roles within the community. Is that fair to say?
So actually, there's a slide that I took out of my presentation because when I was getting it ready, I thought, well, of course, one of the biggest markers is going to be religiosity. And I should be able to map this out. So I went to the website of the Catholic Statistical Institute, and I got their most up-to-date data, and fortunately they had a map. I'm actually, let me just share that right now. I saved the slide in case this might come up. Yeah, so on the one side you can see the voting pattern, the support for Andrzej Duda, and the other side you can see the percentage of regular churchgoers. In Catholic terms, these are Dominicantes, people who go to Mass on Sunday on a regular basis. And this is why I took the slide out. It really doesn't line up that neatly. It's kind of, but also not as perfectly as one would want to make a strong correlation here. So I'm not sure. I think that there are still, despite everything, I think there's still a lot of Catholics in Poland who are alienated from the current church hierarchy and the sort of very traditionalist gender politics of the clergy, but yet who still self-identify as Catholics, and even who still go to church. I think they're sliding away, right? I think more and more of them, and this is based on just anecdotal personal evidence, more and more are ceasing to go to church because they're finding it an uncomfortable place to be if they don't buy into the cultural politics of the current that dominates in the clergy. But they're still there, and so it's not quite a one-on-one between religiosity and the cultural divide. But it's there. It is there, just maybe not as starkly as I would have actually initially expected it to be.
So the Q&A is filling up, and which is great, but we will probably have to stop it sooner rather than later, since we're already approaching the end of the hour. We're scheduled to go to 5:30, but we'll probably let our speakers and our guests, of course, off the hook from Zoom fatigue a little bit earlier than that. But there are a number of questions about this. About corruption and the way corruption is being formulated within the political rhetoric, where and Arthur Mengozi, who's a first-year student in the MIRS program at CREASE, has brought this up in the Q&A with regard to the parallel between what was described during the presentations as the communitarian view of corruption as being basically a kind of nepotism, people who are not qualified to be in the judiciary being nominated for the judiciary. And the parallel between that and the way corruption is being criticized in the Trump administration, where nepotism is quite obvious because we have a number of people serving in high office who have absolutely no qualifications for those offices. So the question that Arthur has posed is whether you believe that the anti-Trzaskowski rhetoric on the other side reflects a particular attitude, a kind of different attitude toward corruption that says that no, corruption is actually meritocracy itself, or otherwise people, sort of high-level financial transactions that would seem to shape policy.
Exactly. Yeah, no, that's a great insight. Yeah. It's not. I mean, corruption as a rhetorical tool appears all over the place, but what is meant by corruption is different. So, financial dealings, which among a sort of cosmopolitan meritocratic Euro group might seem just like a deal, is going to look like corruption from another perspective, particularly if it involves transnational finance. And the other issue with corruption, and I really want to know, I would like to know what you think of this, Anya. I'm sure you saw the famous interview done during the parliamentary elections where some anonymous interviewee said, who was a peace supporter, said, of course they steal, but they also give back. And so, whereas the other guys, they just steal and get rich. I don't know. I don't know how that, it's one line. I've always wondered what to make of that.
What I would note is that however much corruption is being thrown around, nepotism is a very sort of narrow slice of that, right? And I think what we need to keep in mind is, in comparison of Hungary, for example, in Hungary you have the establishment of a mafia state. You have massive enrichment by the political elites. Orban built a football stadium next to his new mansion in his home village. These are extraordinary public and obvious acts of corruption. The current ruling party in Poland doesn't indulge in that, right? You don't see these obvious actions of grand corruption. And nepotism, frankly, it is true that there are political appointees to the judiciary in Poland. That's very different from nepotism, which is literally sort of, hiring relatives and people with whom you have a conflict of interest. That's not happening in Poland. And the kind of politicization of both the judiciary and of the state administration has a long tradition in democratic Polish politics. So, however much you want to criticize peace, I think there are ways in which, relatively speaking, it could always be worse.
Yeah.
That's the optimism.
Yeah.
If I could throw in my own follow-up to that remark, is that because of some in what you would regard as as a political scientist and a historian as a durable value within Polish public life, that we're not the kind of people to build a stadium next to my mansion in my home village, or is it actually attributable to what you both presented at the beginning of your remarks, and that's the kind of atomization of the Polish political landscape, where there just isn't, they don't have a consolidation of power sufficient enough to be able to pull those resources out of the state. Is it incompetence or is it value?
I'd argue it's incompetence, or rather it's an unwillingness to go whole hog, partly because of the fears of electoral retribution, partly because they're not quite sure where it is, and partly because, frankly, Kaczynski's whole goal and PiS's whole goal is to remake Polish politics. It's much less, this is a much more ambitious project, right? This is supposed to be the Fourth Republic, where you extirpate all the legacies of communists and of not real Poles and the worst sort of Poles and anything that's not truly Polish as they envision it. So in many ways, this is a much more grandiose and ambitious project than Orban's sort of, incumbency forever and a steady stream of rents that he collects.
Yeah, I absolutely. I think that's right. I mean, Kaczynski's own personal views here, his own personality might matter, in that he's quite puritanical. He is ideologically driven to create this new state. He's not a mafioso, right? So he's not Putin, he's not Orban. He's a different kind of creature, and he's really he himself he lives quite modestly. And I think as long as he's around and has a firm grip on the party, that's going to constitute a check on corruption. I mean, there have been scandals. There have been scandals of people enriching themselves. But he's actually stepped in and slapped them down. Now, the moment he's gone, this gets back to your question, Ben, is there anything about, deeply ingrained that prevents this corruption from going? I don't think so. I think once he's gone, all bets are off.
But then again, once he's gone, given the nature of this kind of continuously reforming atomization of the landscape, it's easy for me to imagine that the party simply disappears with him. That so much of that these parties tend to be very much personality driven, more than, as you both pointed out, there is no concrete policy program for most of these parties.
I think for peace, I think there is. I would say that there absolutely is for peace. Now, but having said that, when Kaczynski's gone, they will fragment. So, so both things are simultaneously true. There is a vision, and now it's not a vision about economic policy. It's not a vision, not really even about foreign policy, but it's a vision about the nature of politics. That politics is about order and discipline, and unity. And that is a common thread that will be there even if Kaczynski's gone. But without his strong personality, there are a lot of other strong personalities just beneath him that are going to start tearing themselves apart. They already are.
And yeah, they already are doing that. I mean, Ziobro, the reason why Kaczynski is now a deputy prime minister is to basically neutralize Ziobro and to clip his wings and to also assert power within the government. That was basically, it was a clear move in response to Ziobro's very ambitious agenda over the summer.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah.
So if we can hold you both for two more questions.
Sure.
Just two more. One is actually a question that was asked by several participants who were curious about, wanted both of you to elaborate a little bit more about the role of the church in politics, specifically as it relates to what would seem to be the stated values of the Roman Catholic Church as announced by Pope Francis versus the alignment of peace with the Catholic Church in Poland, because as Chris Hojepa is a second-year law student, he points out that the recent pronouncements by Pope Francis on things like opposing ethnocentrism and populism would seem to run counter to the function of ethnocentrism and populism that is specifically and explicitly articulated by the party that most closely aligns with the church.
Yeah, no, it's that encyclical did not go over well among certainly some of the more vocal Polish Catholics. I was looking at some of the responses in some of the more right-wing periodicals last week, and Pope Francis is not popular in those circles, not at all. And the sort of there was for a long time a very sort of ultramontane, that in the classic sense, very papal sense of Catholicism in Poland, but that lasted as long as there was a Pole in the Vatican. And then it lasted a little longer, right, because it still was along many of the same policies. But now with Francis, there's been quite a lot of pushback. The gaps, of course, they're not going to make them, the bishops are not going to speak out against the Pope. That's not going to happen. But the reading between the lines, what doesn't get said, it makes it really clear that there are sharp differences between the episcopate in Poland and the Vatican.
I think for the Polish hierarchy, there's only one pope, and that was John Paul II. And Francis is far too liberal and far too cosmopolitan for them. And if you notice what happens when already in the early 2000s, there's, while Pope John Paul is still alive, you have a situation where the church gets attacked or accused of pedophilia scandals, a charge that keeps coming up and up again. And their response is to turn to John Paul II to basically defend them. And when he dies and that doesn't work, that's when we see the flowering gender ideology and most recently the LGBT ideology, right? Those charges that these are sort of, this is cultural warfare, that this is some kind of a cultural site that's being fought by basically outside forces against true Poles, is partly fought because the church is very much trying to defend its position in Polish society. And this is another way to deflect attention from its own shortcomings, both financial and moral.
Yeah.
Oh,
there's a real irony here that just occurred to me, is that the Polish Catholic Church has become very fixated on as the Polish Catholic Episcopate has become more united around a very, very ultra-conservative agenda, they have grown more critical of the Vatican, sort of more divergent from the Vatican. Back when John Paul was still around, and the Vatican was a source of conservative, cultural values, there was still quite a lot of diversity among the Polish Episcopate. And that is now all gone. So there's been this sort of crossing trends here.
Yeah, and your responses also kind of they resonate for me in just my own engagement with Poland kind of on the ground, that the visual iconography that suggests membership or identification with the communitarians and the meritocrats, however we wish to kind of divide these people up, among the people that whom Brian described as the communitarians, there's still a lot of very Pope or Vatican oriented imagery, but it seems to have forgotten that John Paul II has died. It seems to be referring to an entirely different era.
Yeah.
Which is quite interesting. So there are a couple of questions that relate to just generally speaking to the kind of landscape of political knowledge, let's say, that how we understand the people's political identifications. Jeff Tomaszewski has an additional question asking about, and I personally know very little about this, about polling predictions, because there is, of course, especially for us right now, there's a lot of anxiety about how accurate polling data is. And then there's another question that I kind of want to make this a double header from Aristia Kola, who is a first-year graduate student in the CREASE program, having to do with reaching out to the youth. And this actually, in an interesting way, loops together Professor Robbins' presentation yesterday, where we see this kind of a diminishing voter base among the younger portion of the population, and a lot of younger people emigrating or not participating in the political process. So it's sort of a double-sided question. One is how reliable is the information we get about people's voting behavior both before and after the elections, and how much attention are the parties paying to reaching out to develop a voting base, an electoral base among the younger population.
So why don't I share my screen and show you a graph of the predictions of the Polish elections, so I can do that hopefully successfully.
It was a desert.
Can you guys see it?
Yeah.
Great. So this was, this is the polls, which is a fantastic website operated by Ben Stanley, who's a professor in Poland. And you can sort of see that this is sort of, these are the percentages. This was before the first round of the elections. These are basically accumulations and agglomerations of all the different polls. And the results almost exactly reflect these. The Polish electorate is actually quite transparent to polling. Duda wins. Trzaskowski had a minimal chance, and then of course the other candidates basically don't have much of a standing at all. So when it comes to public opinion polls, it's very much the case that there isn't sort of a hidden vote for either one of these parties, and there's a very nice mapping of public opinion polls onto actual results. When it comes to mobilizing younger voters, there's a lot of lip service to the youth organizations. There's absolutely no common language. There's no sort of real attempt to speak the language of young people and actually reach out to them, tell them why it's important to vote and why it's important to vote for this particular party. The only group that's been doing any of that kind of outreach is the extreme right wing. And they've been very successful there.
Yeah, just recently there was a new law passed on the direct initiative of Mr. Kaczynski to ban the fur industry, and then to also add some other legislation for animal rights. And it turns out that the inspiration from this came from a young man, actually, who was Polish American, but then went back to Poland. He's from Chicago, who told Kaczynski that if you want to reach out to young people like me, this is a gesture that will be very well received. Because young people care about nature. That was the line. And Kaczynski himself likes animals, he's not sure, why not? So in fact, he pushed forward this piece of legislation, which infuriated a lot of rural voters, and led to a crisis in the government, as even a bunch of peace delegates in the Sejm voted against Kaczynski's measure. I believe it's still in the Senate right now, right? I think it's still in the Senate. I don't think it's become law yet. But in any case, that's their idea of outreach to young people. There's no indication that I've seen that it has any effect whatsoever. But what's interesting about that, though, is that at least at the center of Law and Justice, there's a recognition that they're losing the young people. They know this, and that they would like to do something about it, but they don't quite know how. On the other side, the problem is, first of all, inexplicable organizational inertia. The just failure to develop vibrant youth organizations, but also this very, very delicate balancing act, because one way to appeal to those younger voters is to appeal to a more a sort of European cultural identity that would actually be very very pro-feminist, pro-gay rights, and all of this, that will simultaneously alienate older voters, even those on the in the centrist parties. So they don't quite. Nobody wants to quite go there, and Trzaskowski has moved in that direction. He's gestured in that direction, particularly as mayor before he began his presidential campaign, but then ran away from it in the presidential campaign. So yeah, so the younger voters are not being catered to.
No, it seems like it's one shambling group versus another shambling group in a way.
That is, yep, yeah, as Anna said, that's exactly right.
Well, I think that might be the somewhat farcical tone,
Which is appropriate,
right? And hopefully, we can all hope that we encounter our own electoral results in the next couple of weeks with a bit more clarity in the results. Thank you both, Professor Anna Grzymała-Bus and Professor Brian Porter-Szucs, for helping us try to disentangle what is, clearly an extremely messy political landscape in Poland. And thank you to all of the participants in today's webinar for helping us engage with these questions. Please do visit the website of the Copernicus Center for for information about our forthcoming events. And thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.